Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
I'm Tony.
And we're continuing our look at kind of the lesser theodicies that Scott Christensen has brought up in his book, where he's going to put forth his explanation for what is evil all about, what's the best explanation. We've covered in the past kind of the free will defense and the natural state of the world to natural law to inform the non-moral aspect of evil. And we said, according to the author, there were issues with that. And so we're in the middle of our chapter 6 here of working with the greater good, where we're discussing both the greater good theology as well, theodicy, as well as some of the other explanations that either get put forth or help to explain different parts of evil.
Yeah, and it was rather fascinating, his discussion of the free will defense and how he didn't think that, even though it was good, he didn't think that it exactly worked, and all the issues that he brought out with it, right? Right. And so we see here now in this theodicy, as we've been working our way through that, several of these things, he's going to use some of this stuff as part of his particular position. He's still going to point out, as we've seen, some issues with this, at least various versions, but he looks like he's going to use some of this stuff.
Yeah, so this isn't new stuff that's just coming out of nowhere, that he's the first person ever. Right, and you know that old saying of if you've never heard it before in church history, it's probably incorrect or at the very worst a heresy. Yeah, so he doesn't seem to be doing that, and so we're soon approaching to that spot where if you're thinking like, okay, well, here's all the big critiques. Well, okay, well, what's the rest of the story?
That's right.
So we're
what's the punchline?
And so we're starting on, at least in the hardcover book on page 129, talking about the Soul-Making Theodicy. And so he says here that this is a particular brand of the greater good defense, is this the Soul-Making Theodicy. It was first articulated by the early church father Irenaeus, who kind of existed in that first and second century of early church history. And more recently, it was promoted by the John Hick. The Soul-Making Theodicy says that humans are born in a state of immaturity and must undergo adversity as part of a process of becoming mature. So, kind of why must we go through this life? Why must we start as children and progress into adulthood? Lord willing, why must we go through all this pain and suffering in this world? And so this is kind of to answer a little bit into that category of the question.
Right. He says, only in a world full of suffering and adversity do we see traits such as perseverance and courage and forgiveness and patience and mercy and sympathy and self-sacrifice and that sort of thing. So these virtues, he says, logically require the presence of evil or suffering for their cultivation. So the definition of such virtues is, it's meaningless without, suffering and evil. And so he says that Scripture consistently commends suffering for the character that it produces, right? And you would think of James chapter 1 right away.
Right, yeah. So I kind of think a little bit about this with the story of the time machine by H.G.Wells, and I always forget the two races. Morlocks is the evil ones, but you had that society that was perfect and perfected, and they didn't know what books were, and all the writings had crumbled because, and not even crumbled, they had decomposed to where when the narrator comes into view and holds it crumbles away. They have this perfect life, except for the Morlocks were taking them away. And so a story that doesn't have the Morlocks there is a boring story. No one's going to read like Once Upon a Time, there was a princess, nothing happened to her, she got married, and the end.
That's right. They lived happily ever after.
Yeah, there has to be.
Actually, they lived happily forever, not after.
Right. So all of our best stories kind of relate to kind of the human nature, the human condition, and those stories that we have adhered up, have really gleaned onto and has stood the test of time, all have this rise and fall of tension. There's a agitator, there's a hero, there's even the anti-hero could be the hero or switch places. We've had all sorts of different storytelling in there, and so this is kind of thinking the process through of well, here's God's story that he's laying out, and this is infuses our character with certain virtues that we couldn't get without evil. So furthermore, a world with adverse consequences for evil behavior is better than one in which God mitigated those consequences. Without consequences for such incidences, there would be no moral lesson learned to strengthen moral character. So that's kind of what we're talking about. You know, you have your hero, maybe he's young and inexperienced, or he's been through 300 wars, and, he's won them all with, no challenge whatsoever. But then it gets interesting when he fails, or there's someone bigger than him, or the young hero finds a master to train him up, and you have the
tension there.
The growth. One would act carelessly with utter abandon and with impunity, though. There would be no need to build character through self-control, honesty, perseverance, alertness, common sense, and wisdom, and the like. So, if you just have all perfect beings existing in the world, you just kind of have a boring life. There's nothing there that you can say, oh, this person is good just by the virtue of them doing something. There's no, I really put, I put 300 hours into drawing this very lifelike picture of my grandmother with only a pencil, and it looks exactly like a photograph. I saw an artist do that today doing 30 hours of this, and it's like, wow, that's really impressive.
I hope you didn't watch it for 30 hours.
Not for 30 hours. It was very nicely done in 90 seconds. And so I went, oh, that's nice, and clicked away. So, all his hard work was definitely felt by me. We would be less inclined to deem certain things sinful because there would be no ill effect to doing those things. If death refuses to operate for a day, we'd all be throwing ourselves off buildings, and that was fun. And then soon it would get boring and stuff like that. And there are some really good books that I've read that have taken that concept of living for forever and really talked about how damning it would be. And so those are really interesting to read. The greatest displays of moral character are those that are forged in the fires of adversity.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So he says the soul-making theodicy certainly dispels the notion that God created the world for our unmitigated, pain-free blissfulness, right? Where it's just for us and all that kind of stuff. He says what are we to make of this soul-making theodicy, that here we have this evil because, it's attempting, God is trying to accomplish something in us, right? Trying to improve us. He says the principles behind this theodicy are certainly biblical and have tremendous value for the believer, but the theodicy is not without problems.
Very much so.
Right. Many have criticized it, he says, employing the same objections that the Greater-Good defense has. It suffers from other concerns as well. For example, we must admit that while evil has a soul-building effect on Christians, right, it does not have that effect on others, right? Because if it's for us, if it's to improve our character, what about the folks who are not believers?
Yeah.
Right? What effect does it have on those folks, right?
Not all of them are the Darth Vader, the Emperor, the Stormtroopers. they're not all on the other side. And there are just some people who aren't believers that are just generally good people, but they're going through this, and there's nothing that seems to be attained by them through this process in the end. So he quotes Tim Keller here and says that he makes an interesting point about this quote here. Tim Keller says, many people with bad souls get very little of the adversity they apparently need, and many with great souls get an amount that seems to go far beyond what is necessary for spiritual growth. The Psalms, and that's the end of the quote there, the Psalms abundantly testify to this dilemma. Many wicked people seem to prosper while the righteous suffer inordinately.
So not only, we can question whether or not unbelievers are gaining something, but we can also question how come sometimes unbelievers seem to get away with stuff, and and their souls aren't improved, right?
Right. They got away with justice. Justice wasn't meted out against them. Bernie Madoff still lived like a king for so many years, making oodles of cash, and then went to jail and died in the later part of his life. Okay, those are the worst years. Sure, okay. No one really cares at that point, and you still have thousands, millions of people affected by those actions. So where was justice and all that?
Yeah.
And I do think too, on both sides of the spectrum, we have a terrible view of what justice is and trying to explain, what fulfillment of justice is. It seems like, okay, you have a trial for someone, they're found guilty, they're put on death row and killed. I don't know how someone can say, oh, justice was done because life was taken for a life without more information there. We just have a society that operates on those rules, and I can see a specific deterrence for that. But I think as far as when it comes to the idea of justice, I think there's more work there that needs to be done by people that I can just put forward the questions and they can do the hard work that I can read about.
We must recognize that we can't know whether adversity has a soul building effect or not. We just can't know. In the case of Cain, for instance, right? Perhaps it didn't, right? It didn't affect him, right? But
he went and lived in a city, and that's the end of that story, yeah.
But obviously in the case of Abraham and Joseph and Moses and Ruth and Daniel and David and so forth, Paul, countless others, yes, it did have this effect. However, he says, nevertheless, the soul-making theodicy has limited value and can never be the basis, he tells us, for a comprehensive theodicy. Is the building of the souls of the faithful through adversity the sole reason, he says, he questions, right, for allowing evil to wreck the beauty and tranquility of the whole created order, right? Destroy the whole thing just to build, my soul. Yeah.
I didn't even ask for this.
Right. Yeah. He says, as important as such soul building is, there must be reasons that penetrate the enigma, he tells us, of this ubiquitous sin and corruption of universal death and decay and of all the manner of catastrophe with, greater depth than the soul-making theodicy does. So he says the idea here is he doesn't believe that this particular position, although it has some merit, goes far enough to explain the amount, right? He says the ubiquitous of sin, even though it's like that, the amount of corruption, the amount of destruction that happens as a result of the evil that's present, right?
So moving on to the kind of the best of all possible worlds defense here.
All right, so this is the next one, right? So now that's the soul-making one. So the next one here is the best of all possible worlds defense. Right. So this is this, and he kind of likes this one, right? He attempts to, at least to a certain extent, defends this one, right?
Yeah, and the kind of the people that we get into are fairly maligned by one side and put up a lot on the other. But we talk about the brilliant German Lutheran philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
That's right.
And so
I like saying that too.
the nuclear vessels. And so he lived roughly between 1646 and 1716. Kind of give you a date there.
Yeah, so he was kind of a contemporary of Isaac Newton.
Yeah,
in fact, they had an ongoing spat about,
Yeah, in more ways than one. But he first propounded the idea that a God of unbridled perfection would create the best world possible. So you have this idea of a God imperfect in every quality, in every aspect. And so what type of world or universe would that type of God create? Well, it would be the greatest possible world you could ever imagine. The greatest show on earth.
That's right. The best possible world.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. God's the P.T. Barnum. Well, I don't know how far you want to take that implication there. Yeah. And so that such a world must contain evil. Why? Because that's the qualities of God that are put forth in Scripture. And so we know that evil exists, and so therefore the best possible world must contain evil. So he has his explanation there as the best of all possible worlds. So this is a best of all possible world because God's the best possible being and contains evil. Therefore, it's a necessary part of the best possible world or universe. So the best of all possible worlds defense is another variation of the greater good defense. For example, Leibniz says, God cooperates morally in moral evil, that is, in sin without being the originator of sin, and even without being accessory thereto. He does this by permitting it justly and by directing it wisely towards good.
Right, so we have God cooperating, right, morally with evil. He cooperates it in terms of he uses it, is the idea.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And he says the best of all possible world defense proceeds from a consideration of the essential attributes that God would necessarily have. So this one takes into account who God is, God's character, God's attributes, right? This means that God, being infinite and omniscient, all-knowing, knows every possible good world, state of affairs is what he's talking about here, right? Not just a planet, right? But a state of affairs, right? Upon surveying all these various states of affairs, these various worlds, God knows which one is superior to all others, and that's the one that he chooses, right? And so because God is supremely wise and good, he chooses to create that single world that he deems perfect, even though, ironically, he tells us, it contains, some sin and, imperfections, right? So this one's kind of interesting. We take God's character into effect. He's wise and, he's infinite. And so he surveys all the kinds of possible worlds, all the kinds of states of affairs, and says, all right, in his perfection, he chooses the perfect, the best of all possible worlds. And that's the one that he chooses to make. And apparently, we see it has imperfections and evil as part of it. But since God is perfect, he chooses the perfect world, right? The best of all possible worlds.
And so because the universe is contingent on God's act of creation, it means that he doesn't have to create that world. But when he does, it also gives him the ability to have a plan for that evil that he will actualize, knowing that it's the best possible world. He knows that evil will come about in it, so he can plan for the salvific work of Christ's actions on the cross applied to people that come to faith through that process and the mercy. He can do that before the foundation of that world. So that's the plan he comes up with. The universe is created, and so therefore he's not surprised that he has to send his only son into the world. He, all the verses that talk about predestining the accomplishments and acts of the cross and all the people leading up to it, it makes that plan able to be known beforehand, essentially. Yeah. So it doesn't catch God off surprise there. So while one can imagine worlds with far less evil or no evil at all, those worlds overall cannot be construed as better. Why? Because otherwise God would have considered them as superior to the world he made. Mm-hmm. So yes, I can think of a world where nothing bad happens to me. That's a better world for me. But is that a better world for the perfect being of God to
That's
create?
Right. For all of creation and what the perfect being of God would do, yeah.
So if a better world is possible and God did not create such a world, then his supreme goodness is maligned.
Right. So he's not as good as he could be if he didn't create the best possible world, right? Well, now here's the issue, and so now he's going to point out a few problems with this particular issue position, right? He says one of the primary objections to the best of all possible worlds defense is that no explanation is given as to how evil specifically contributes to this world's being the best possible world, right? What is the role of evil? How do we know for sure that it being there is the best, right? Leibniz, he says, argues, that we have no obligation to provide an explanation because we're not in a position to know. So, that's none of our business. Right?
Essentially, right.
Right. But that seems, he says, to be an issue here, right?
So this is a same broad objection and response made with respect to the greater good defense answered by a skeptical theism response.
Right.
Again,
so they say a similar type of thing, right?
Exactly.
That we can't know or we ought not attempt to know because that's beyond us and it's only God that knows.
Right. Which, I mean, you kind of go back on your ignorance of it. We don't know. We couldn't know. It's one of those things that's not communicated to us. Therefore, let's have this skeptical mindset of it. I think that's a fair response that people don't like. Again,
because we want to know.
We do want to know, right? Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point of theodicy is having a knowable source.
Yeah, that's right, an explanation.
Again, we can't pretend to know in every instance how the all-wise, all-good, infinitely knowledgeable God uses evil to generate greater goods or to make this the best possible world. Therefore, then, we cannot dictate to God what the best world would look like. We must rescue ourselves as judges of the Almighty and His plans. It is sufficient to rest in God's knowledge of what is best.
Right. So we have to just kind of depend on God as what the response to this particular objection is, right?
And so what Leibniz is doing is he's grounding it in the character of God. And so this is a kind of a conditional statement. If God is like this, then this would be the result. This would be the best possible world. Evil exists in the world, therefore evil is part of that best possible world. And so...
Now, we're going to see in a minute that he's going to find a problem with that.
Right.
A big problem with that.
But I'm just saying that just because we can say, I wish I didn't get in the car accident and lose my arm 15 years ago. It would have been better if I had both arms. Just because I can postulate that doesn't mean that I've defeated this entire argument because I can think of a world where nothing bad has happened or that one instance of a bad happened. He's grounding it in the knowledge and character of who God is.
It's an extremely logical argument. Of course, part of Leibniz was, he not only was a philosopher and a theologian, he was a mathematician. Mm-hmm. In fact, the war that he had with Newton had to do with who invented the calculus, right? And he claimed he was the first one, and of course,
Photo
Newton
finish.
claims he was
too close to call.
And so that was the ongoing argument, and so and so this is a very logical, if God is perfect, if He is all good, then His perfection would to a certain extent allow Him to choose the perfect world.
Right.
And if our world then has evil in it, it must be the perfect world because that's what a perfect God would choose. And so this is just part of the deal, is what he's trying to say here, right?
And if you do logic at all or taking a logic class, you can disagree with those premises, and people do, and that's where they kind of start their attack. But if the premises are true, then it has to follow that the conclusion follows from that.
Right. That's a deductive argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, others, he says, objected we can clearly conceive of a better world, right? This is the point you were trying to make, right? For example, we already know, a new heaven and a new earth, right. Peter talks to us about, right? Yeah. Where evil will be absent, and the Bible makes it clear that the world is, will be far more glorious than this fallen one. So he's going to argue later in chapter 12, so we're going to hold him to it.
A lot longer.
The reason that the future world is so glorious is that it represents the culmination of God's redemptive plan. So that's why it is better, because we had to go through this redemptive plan, right? So redemption, he says, necessitates the prior presence of evil. You got to have that. You got to be redeemed from something, right? From which it emerges.
And it's not erased. It's like Jehovah's Witnesses have this idea that we're annihilated, and then God, in God's mind, we're there, and He recreates us, and that's the thing that goes on. Well, that's not me. Right. I'm annihilated. It's God's image of my perfection that continues on. So this world passes away, but it doesn't get erased. So I think that's a point to bring up here is that history still existed. It doesn't just suddenly wipe out and God starts over from from A prime or from point zero and recreates.
So, so obviously if you're going to have redemption, you have to have be redeemed from something
Right.
evil, right? So redemption is the supreme good, he says, that flows from the presence of a corrupted creation and corrupted creatures, right? And so that's a big one, right?
So a serious objection to Leibniz's view is that he saw both moral and natural evil as built into the natural structure of the world, ignoring original sin, and that is the spread of Adam's sin to subsequent humanity, and the Edenic curse, the curse of the creation due to Adam's sin.
Right.
So, that's what the scriptures teaches from one man's sin. We all fall in his sin, and then creation is disrupted because of that. And we see things like thorns and thistles and hard work and child labor and all the world imploding and exploding after Genesis 3. So he kind of boiled it down to just one aspect of it. So he saw evil as integral to the balance and harmony of the created order. But this can't be. Moral and natural evil cannot be inherited properties of the very good creation that is impeccably good God established.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have been good.
Right. It enters into creation at that point.
Yeah. So he says, it's kind of a paradox, and he says, in one sense, it must be affirmed that God intended the world to experience the curse of sin as a foil for the greater good of redemption. And yet we must also affirm that there is a palpable sense, he tells us, in which this world is decidedly not the way that it's supposed to be, right? And so original sin and the endemic curse have caused an unnatural disruption in the moral fabric of the world and in the natural laws that govern it. So a time, he says, will come when Eden will be restored, right? But this great and future restoration will be far more magnificent than the old evil, and he asks us how.
Right. So we may imagine an unfallen world like Eden before the fall that required no redemption.
There you go. What's wrong with that, right?
The serpent says to Eve, you shall not surely die. She pulls him off the tree, steps on him. He doesn't die because death hasn't entered the world, and he goes out into the outer darkness, sad and alone. Where,
so when she steps on him, she just shuts him up. She doesn't kill him.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. No death in the world.
She doesn't need a belt yet, so yeah. So that world requires no redemption, and we might even say that such a world would be better than this present one, all things being equal. But that could never compare to the future world described in Scripture, because its supreme glory is made glorious only by the fact that it will be reformed, and that's 2 Peter 3:10 through 13, out of this fallen world of futility to which God subjected it to. So that Eden existed, it was there, good. But even there, what was the command of God? To go out from the garden and expand the garden. That was kind of what
fruitful and multiply, cultivate it. And
that wasn't after Genesis 3. That was realized more fully after Genesis 3. But that was the command to take the world and form it more, to glorify it more, to be the ambassadors of the world to God, bringing them into that relationship that wouldn't have been broken at that time for sin. But that's going to happen more fully, and God's the author and sustainer of that recreation too.
Right. So notice what he's arguing here is that a reformed world after a redemption is somehow better than the original world that was good, right? So as a result of going through this evil and redemption occurring, it's better. And I think part of it has to do with God reveals himself, through this, his fullness, right? Due to redemption.
Fullness. I think that's the key, is how do we know God is a God of mercy? How do we know that God is a God of redemption? How do we know that God is a God who forgives and is able to take people that hate him and change their hearts and wipe away their sin because he has justified them, and just being the key thing there. How is that all revealed?
Right.
And I'll skip ahead a little bit because he's going to say Romans 9,
Yeah.
but I'll say also Romans 9 tells us just that fact is how can God reveal those things without something like the fall occurring, other than just God saying, I'm just. And we're like, what is justice?
Yeah, what does that
I don't know
mean?
what that means in a pre-fallen state.
I'm forgiving. I'm forgiving.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Right. Disobedience to God. Why would we do that thing? Now I can go, disobedience to God. I'll take one, please.
Yeah.
So he goes on here to finish to say that heaven's joy is made brightest only when preceded by the most tenebrous tears soaking the earth. So it's from kind of the ashes it rises.
So he says, though, and so here's the nub. Here's the problem, the major problem, at least as I see it, right? He says, having said this, we still cannot advance the best of all possible worlds defense as a satisfying theodicy for another important reason. Well, what is it? Well, it undermines, notice, the freedom of God in creation. Leibniz suggested that God's supreme wisdom united to a goodness that is no less infinite, cannot but have chosen the best, right? So Leibniz appears, he tells us here, to be saying that only one world could qualify as the best of all possible worlds. If that is true, he tells us, then it follows that if this is indeed the best of all possible worlds, then it must be, and here's the nub here, logically necessary for God to have created this. God had to do it. God had no choice. God had no freedom. This is what he had to do.
Right.
Right. And so this makes God's act of creation itself logically necessary. Well, is that what we really want?
Yeah.
Right.
No. So a more faithful way to ponder a perfect creator who has perfect freedom to consider the following two claims about the world. First, that this is the best of all possible worlds.
So that's Leibniz's position,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
But two is there is no possible world better than this world. So you're like, what's the difference there?
Yeah.
Well, claim one, which Tony says what Leibniz made, certainly entails claim two, right? So this is the best of all possible worlds, and there are no possible worlds better than that world. That's what that agrees to.
Right.
But the second claim isn't true in reverse. Claim two does not entail claim one. Claim one, this is the best of all possible worlds, is a stronger claim, but it commits Leibniz to far more than the evidence can sustain. Claim two, that is, there is no possible world better than this world, is more modest and defensible. And he says, well, why? Because it preserves God's freedom as well as the optimally great God that Leibniz rightfully affirms.
Right. In other words, claim two says that there may be other worlds equal to this world, but that there is no possible world better than this world, right? So that it leaves open how one might judge what an optimally good world must look like. There's no single criterion of goodness by which to judge such a world. One would, with more goodness, may be better in some respects, he tells us, whereas one with less goodness may be better in other respects, right? So the point is this: there may be any number of possible worlds, right? Any number of equally optimal worlds, exemplifying the highest good that an optimally good God could have chosen to create, that do not deny his freedom. So, the way to get around this is to say, as you said, claim two, which was there is no possible world better than this world, right? Now, there may be other possible worlds as good, and so God is free to choose among various possible worlds. And so by that, he says this saves God's freedom, right?
Right.
We probably should...
that was a lot to take.
Yeah, in our discussion here and pick this last portions up next time.
Right, absolutely. So next time we're looking at the divine judgment defense, and we get into some really interesting points here, especially for those of you who keep asking me about hell, most of my time I just say, well, just wait until we're done with the whole book. I'm sure it's in here. And so he treats the subject of hell
briefly.
Briefly, and also what we always like, footnotes at the bottom where they belong, and expanded reading there, and kind of other side aspect to it.
Right. So he has one more defense that he wants us to take a look at.
Right.
Now, again, we need to keep in mind that so far he hasn't given us his particular take, right, on the greater good defense.
So
he's looking at
we stop here,
here.
and we've just destroyed all theodicies, and we're good, and other people can do this work. So that's all we want to do. No. Yeah. So yes. So we'll finish up here with chapter 6 next time, and we'll start to move on to his view of things. He's got to lay some things out first. Because he's going to reveal more in chapter 12, and like you said, we're going to hold him to it and see what he says there. So, as always, thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching our stuff. We hope that you liked a couple episodes back, discussion of hermeneutics and how that relates to apologetics and your own Bible study. And I know I got a lot out of it, and a lot of book recommendations from there as well. And hopefully this also helps to entice you to understand that what we want to do is be able to not just have good arguments for things that we think add to the discussion of whether God exists or why we should believe in him, but that we ground it in the revealed scriptures that we claim to follow. And so that's what we're doing here by being critical of these different theodicies, is that they're not just good arguments, that we want to make them scriptural arguments. Yeah. So that's what we're doing. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.